Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome everyone to our business hour today. This is our third in our employment law risk management series, Avoiding Common Employment Mistakes. And today's session is going to be focusing on avoiding mistakes and handling ADA situations. My name is Jim Boutros. I'm the chair of the Labor and Employment Practice here at McDonald Hopkins, and with me are my two partners and colleagues, Miriam Rosen to my immediate right, and then Nicole Gray. Miriam and I are from our Detroit office, and Nicole hails here from the Cleveland office. I said this is the third in our series. We're having a series of four. For those of you that have been attending, you know in February we spoke about avoiding mistakes and handling government investigations. In May we talked about avoiding mistakes and handling FMLA and related leave issues. Today we're focusing on the ADA. And for those of you that are planners, like me, and want to set your calendars now, on November 13th, we will have our culmination in this series, and it's going to be avoiding mistakes in handling the termination process. So you'll see more on that, but you can go ahead and mark your calendars now. As always, we invite questions throughout the program. For those of you here in Cleveland, you have question cards. Simply write down your question, and one of our McDonald Hopkins staff would be happy to bring the question up, and we will address it accordingly. For those of you in our webcast audience, you have an icon that you can click on and submit a question, and those questions will be brought up to us as well. We do endeavor to address every question that we get, but if we do run out of time, we'll be here for those in Cleveland afterwards if you want to address any of your questions for those here in our Cleveland office. And for those of you on our webcast, we will get back to you via email. I always do like to plug the Business Advocate. That's our online community. Those of you that are regular clients of ours are familiar with that. You did receive a link and a temporary password to that by registering for this program. That's where Miriam, Nicole, myself, our other labor and employment colleagues, our other lawyers are blogging about the latest developments in their respective areas. We, of course, are focused on the labor and employment area, but we do invite you to join that community and stay up to date and join our discussion relative to the issues facing employers, and like I said, in our other areas. Last, we really do encourage, we will be emailing a survey relative to this program today. We invite your constructive criticism. We value it. We incorporate your comments into our programs, not only relative to the contents of today's program, but other topics that you might want us to hit on. We do take those recommendations very seriously, so please take the time to do that. All right, let's start with avoiding mistakes and handling ADA situations. What are we going to be talking about today? We're going to hit four key areas. First, recognizing when the ADA is triggered. For those of you familiar with the ADA, you know it went through an overhaul in 2009, and so the definitions have been expanded as to who qualifies as being disabled, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to focus significantly on effectively engaging in the interactive process that the EOC wants us to engage in and providing reasonable accommodations when they're required. We're also going to be focusing on properly involving medical personnel and opinions when we need them, in particular in making decisions relative to requested accommodations, and then properly documenting ADA situations. And with that, let me turn it over to Nicole to begin, please.
Okay. So one of the complaints I hear from employers pretty frequently is, why is this process with disability so hard? Why is it so difficult? Why is it so confusing? And believe me, we appreciate that, and we share a lot of that frustration. So when we're looking at some of the reasons or causes for why the difficulty in administering or handling disability situations, one of the factors we have to consider is that there are a number of laws that could be in play when you're dealing with a medical condition. So you have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we'll talk a lot about today, but then a lot of times it overlaps with the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, or state laws about leave, as well as workers' compensation. In fact, we typically call that the Bermuda Triangle, when you have FMLA, ADA, and workers' comp all come together. And they have differing requirements. So that always causes a problem for employers to say, okay, well, FMLA has a definite time. Doesn't ADA have that same time? 12 weeks and we're done, right? So those are some of the things that we have to contend with as employers. Additionally, we have an expanding scope of disabilities. As Jim mentioned, the ADA was amended in 2008, and with that, we got an expanded scope of who is a person with a disability. Before that, employers were really successful at being able to narrow the idea of who or who qualified as a person with a disability and what was a disabling condition. With the amendments, it opened it up greatly, and so we have an expanded scope of an increased the number of individuals who are considered now to be persons with disabilities. We also are faced with an aggressive government agency, and typically it stems from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, although I've seen it at the state level as well with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission being more aggressive in disability claims. In fact, as part of the EEOC's strategic plan, one of its major objectives was enforcement, or the objectives were enforcement, education and outreach, promotion of a diverse workforce. And one of the ways that they are addressing those objectives is by eliminating barriers in recruitment, hiring, and employment. So that's looking at individuals that fall within protected classes, including persons with disabilities. And in fact, the EEOC has sort of waged a war on certain aspects of employers' policies dealing with disability, and especially leave, which Miriam will talk about more later. Additionally, the EEOC, traditionally we've advised clients that we want people to be treated in the same manner, right? We want to show that people in the protected class are treated the same as those outside of the protected class. However, with disability situations, the EEOC now wants us to do an individual case-by-case analysis. So every case being analyzed, is this a person with a disability? Is there a reasonable accommodation that can be made? Which again puts a burden on an employer. Additionally, there's a misunderstanding of the ADA and the interactive process a lot of times by your frontline managers, and those are the people who are typically dealing firsthand with employees who have medical issues that need to be addressed and potentially accommodated. So just as a refresher, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires no discrimination of disabled persons and disabled employees or applicants, and reasonable accommodation of employees or applicants to either apply for a position or to perform the job's essential functions. So when we talk about accommodation, includes things like modified workspace, modified schedule, maybe modified policy, could be leave. The ADA does not set a time limit on its length of leave, so it's different in that respect from the Family Medical Leave Act, which has a 12-week time period. And the ADA is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So when we talk about the idea that the definition of disability was expanded, what do we mean and what does that cover? Well, a disability under the ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. However, under the umbrella of disability can also be a record of having such an impairment or being regarded as having a disability. So there are actually 3 ways that a person could be covered under the ADA. And when we're looking at the expanded definition and what did the ADA amendments really do, well, they expanded the definition of major life activities. So now we include major bodily functions. So immune system, these are kind of general categories. Immune system, normal cell growth, which could be cancer, which previously, if you were in remission, if you had cancer and you were in remission, we would argue you weren't a person with a disability. However, now, not anymore. We also, with the amendments, got an establishment of per se disabilities, so things that are automatically going to be a disability, as well as there was a broadening of the regarded as category. As a result, when you have this expanded definition of disabilities, it really takes away the employer's first line of defense, which was, you're not a person with a disability, we don't have to continue on about reasonable accommodation. And we were actually pretty successful at winning those cases. with making that argument. Now, it's not so much, are you a person with a disability or not? It's almost a given a lot of times that the person is going to be with a disability if it's not temporary, if it's not transitory. And then we're looking at, the EEOC wants you to look past the question of are they a person with a disability to, is there a reasonable accommodation that this individual needs because of a medical condition?
I just wanted to highlight the point that Nicole is making here relative to the expanded view. I mean, she was talking about how as lawyers and employers, we were successful, in essence, talking individuals out of being disabled under the law. And so I'll give you an example. Whenever we were taking depositions in ADA cases, you would start with asking the individual, well, how did you get here this morning? What did you do when you got up? Well, I got up, I brushed my teeth, I combed my hair, I had breakfast. Did you drive here? Yeah, I drove here. And in essence, you could get them rolling down this path of saying, well, I can do everything that you can do. And in essence, they would talk their way right out of coverage under the statute because it's definitionally driven. Unlike race, unlike gender, which I can tell pretty much just by looking at someone, and those are inherent characteristics, this was definitionally driven. And it still is, but that definition now, the effectiveness of that line of questioning, it's just not what it was, as Nicole is highlighting here, because of the expansion of what constitutes a disability. She brought up the notion of cancer and remission. It used to be, for example, with diabetes. You would have one individual that responded really well to insulin treatment. They didn't need to take breaks. Their blood sugar levels were well monitored, but another individual did not. Well, in that instance, one would have been disabled and one wouldn't have under the law because one was successful with the medical treatment and the other was not. Forget that now. That won't apply. They both will be disabled under the law. So we really have lost some of our principal defenses and definitional defenses that we once had.
Right, and so with a disability, it still has to substantially limit, but it's only one major life activity, a major life activity. So, the odds that a person can establish that with this expanded view of who's a person with a disability, it's far more likely. And with that, when we have an expanded definition of disability, come expanded accommodation and obligations. So now we're looking at, employers a lot of time for the first time are dealing with situations where they have to make some kind of adjustment or modification to the workplace. So when we're looking at an accommodation request, how do you as an employer recognize, is the accommodation process triggered? Has this person given me enough information where I know that I need to take the next step to have a discussion about reasonable accommodation? And an employee, definitely the burden is on the employee to communicate the need for an adjustment or a modification to the work environment due to their medical condition. But the employee doesn't have to use magic words. They don't have to come to you and say, I have an ADA qualifying condition and I need to discuss a reasonable accommodation. It would be great if employees did that. It would make it a lot, for clarity purposes, it would help employers. However, typically it comes in a much less formal and less clear request. And it may not even be presented as a request. Sometimes it may be an offhand comment that someone makes about, I'm on this medication and it makes me really groggy in the morning and I have a hard time getting to work. So that may be sufficient information to at least trigger a follow-up discussion. So I give you some examples here of an employee says, I'm having trouble getting to work on time because of medical treatments. Well, here they've said they're having a problem with the work environment, so getting to work on time with their schedule, and they've attributed it to a medical condition. So it at least triggers for the employer to have a follow-up discussion.
And I would say that would be great if they were saying it to HR, because HR people will probably get what they're saying but usually they're saying it to their manager,
Right.
who may not understand that that's a request for an accommodation. And so when we talk about how to avoid mistakes, I think that's what we have to get at. How do you get to those managers to help them understand when you hear comments like that, at least give HR a heads up.
Right, exactly. And it's also, again, one of the reasons why, we talked about at the beginning, why is this process frustrating for employers or difficult? And that's one of the reasons is these requests don't come through your HR department or for people who have, kind of this is on their radar screen or can issue spot this. It comes through your frontline manager, your shop floor manager. I give you another example of an employee tells a supervisor that he'd like a new chair because his is uncomfortable. Well, here, I'd like a new chair, but I'm not equating that to a medical condition. So this would not be a situation where there's sufficient information that this would be a request for accommodation.
Before we move on, we did have a couple of questions that we received before we began today. And before we get too far off the topic, a question was raised relative to handling, in particular, like vision and weight as disabilities. And, how can those conditions constitute, or do they constitute, disabilities? Relative to thoughts relative to that?
Well, I think those are kind of broad categories as far as they could certainly have symptoms that make it a disability. If there was a vision issue that's caused a problem in the workplace, then
right.
And required an accommodation, then
right.
that could certainly be a trigger there.
Yeah,
Or morbid obesity and having a
High blood pressure.
Correct.
Those types of
Yeah,
things.
I'd say certainly with the weight issue that I think one thing we see that Nicole mentioned the EOC is being very aggressive, and one thing that we see is that they're pushing the weight issue, morbid obesity. That's a hot issue for them.
Yes.
But they can't tackle it exactly as weight, so they're going around it and trying to come up with the side effects of weight, the other conditions that often come with weight. But I absolutely think that's a hot issue for them. In some states, weight is a protected category, like Michigan, a few states, and maybe some cities actually. Weight is included in protected categories all by itself. So.
Well, and to Miriam's point, I think we're seeing the EEOC try to address things that are growing concerns in the American workforce. They're morbid obesity as well as pregnancy. Typically before, pregnancy, it was pretty clear you could say was not a disability. Then the EEOC came out with guidance saying, well, but we should address pregnancy because there may be symptoms or conditions that arise from the pregnancy that would be disabilities and would be covered. And so, I think that the EEOC is certainly trying to get individuals coverage under the ADA.
Yeah, I would say we included a couple articles at the back of your program, and we could have included the one on pregnancy discrimination, right. Because what the EEOC did in issuing that guidance is actually it's guidance on pregnancy discrimination and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's almost as if they've made pregnancy a de facto disability because there's now an obligation to accommodate.
Mm-hmm. And relative to vision, just while we're on it, that is still one where the employer is able to take advantage of mitigating circumstances like eyeglasses, and so it wouldn't constitute, that's really one of the only ones left.
Yeah, I think, right, just a general bad
right.
vision, I need glasses,
yeah,
but
nearsighted. Right.
But if you're glaucoma or whatever,
or blind, then
right.
that's a different. As a matter of fact, I have an example of an accommodation process I'll talk about later involving an employee who's blind. So again, it's kind of this is what you'll hear from us the whole time, and this is why you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. Every disability, every condition is a little bit different, and so what you have to do is a little bit different.
And that actually goes right into this next example on the next slide is a situation where an employee requests a fragrance-free workplace due to a chemical allergy that causes migraines, nausea, and chest tightness. And frontline manager has not gotten their ADA training yet, and says, that's ridiculous, and disregards the request. The employee suffers a reaction, doesn't return to work, ends up getting fired, and then sues. And this was actually a case. It comes from a case where an employee with asthma and severe chemical sensitivity to perfumes requested that the employer ban fragrances from the workplace. And the response was the same: that's ridiculous. We can't tell people they can't wear perfume or cologne. Well, the court found that this was actually a reasonable request, that the employee did have a disability that would be covered by the ADA, and then this request to have a fragrance-free workplace was in fact reasonable. So to Miriam's point, we need to go back to, we have to assess the nature and the severity of the medical condition through the use of information from a medical professional, right? So we need to assess, what does it mean that this person has a chemical allergy? Does this mean, asthma? Does this mean it's controlled by an inhaler and it's not a substantial impairment on any major life activity? They have a flare-up maybe once a year. They see the doctor, maybe once a year. Well, that's a different situation than an individual who has a severe reaction, has to go to the hospital, has to miss work for multiple days because of chest pain and unable to breathe. So they may have the same condition, it may be called asthma, but we need to look at those on an individual basis and find out, well, what is actually the functional limitation here? And that's where, again, training managers to issue spot. They don't need to address that themselves. They don't need to engage the employee even in a discussion, but they need to know to recognize it and to bring it to someone who will address it. And then we need to establish, is this a disability, and is there an accommodation? And we do that through the use of medical documentation. So another part of the accommodation, or what triggers the accommodation process, is, and we get the question a lot of times, well, should I ask the employee? Should I ask them if they need an accommodation? And generally, as I said before, it's the employee's burden to ask for the reasonable accommodation and certainly put the employer on notice. But the EEOC has given us some guidance that there are certain circumstances where the employer could initiate that process. And it's limited, but it may apply in certain circumstances. So it's a situation where an employee has a known disability. The employer knows that the employee is experiencing a workplace problem because of that disability, knows or has reason to know that the disability prevents the employee from requesting a reasonable accommodation. Here, those are the steps that or the threshold that we're looking at as far as when the employer can initiate that. If the individual, you go through that process and the individual says, I don't need anything, even though they have a disability, you see these issues, you ask them, is there anything that the company can provide in order to afford you the ability to perform your essential functions of your job? And they say no. Well, you document that and your process has ended. But it doesn't mean that the process couldn't be reopened in the future if need be. So when you...
Oh, please, we have a question.
Yeah,
Go ahead. And we'll repeat it so everyone hears it.
The question is, how do you balance the interactive process with the regarded as issue? Because we had a situation where I was at where the employee was exhibiting bizarre behavior. She was writing inordinately long emails. She was sticking around after work for 2 and 3 hours doing who knows what, even though she had been told to go home. When her supervisor called her in, she would respond with these emails that were totally off the point. And the supervisor wanted to send her for a medical eval. I actually said, I don't think you should do that yet, because it may be a matter of maybe this person just needs to get into the disciplinary process. Because if you do that, and just like you said, if the medical eval comes back that there's nothing wrong, or this employee says, I don't want to do the medical eval, well, now don't you have a regarded as situation?
Well, so just for those of you on the webcast, there was a question as to how do you balance the engaging in the interactive process and the regarded as person with a disability category, and how do you make sure that you're not assuming or having a situation where the person believes that you think that they are a person with a disability. And I think our next example sort of starts to touch on that. And here, the EEOC, this guidance that the EEOC has given us as to when the employer can initiate the reasonable accommodation process is very specific. It's in a situation where you know that the individual has a disability. That information has already been disclosed. And they're exhibiting signs of struggling with something in the workplace because of that disability. And then that's when the employer has the ability to initiate that process. If you have a situation, and the question that was presented, or the situation that was presented was, if you have an individual who's suddenly exhibiting bizarre behavior in the workplace, and and the supervisor wanted to send her for a medical evaluation. And that's where a lot of times I think employers get into trouble, is where they take on the role of being a doctor. Right. We are not doctors, right? And so if there are performance issues exhibited, if there's bizarre behavior happening in the workplace, if they're sending non-responsive emails, if they're staying after work, not needed and not clear what they're doing, then those are the things that need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. The actual behavior that's being exhibited needs to be addressed in a discussion, right? So, and that could be through a performance discussion or a discipline situation, where if it was severe, where their work wasn't getting done. And that, the focus for an employer, the first focus needs to be, if you don't know about a disability and things are happening in the workplace that are performance related, that you address them as being performance related and allow the employee the opportunity to tell you, well, this is because I have a medical condition. But the employer's focus should be not on the why, but on the what's being seen and what's observed in the workplace. And then the employee's burden is to attribute that, is to fill in the why.
I agree with the way that you handled that. But you're right. We always used to say ignorance was bliss when it came to the ADA, because if I don't know and all I'm doing is I'm reacting or dealing with what is occurring and not asking why is it occurring, it kept me safe. I think that ability is a little bit hamstrung now, just because the EOC is so aggressive about wanting us to engage in the interactive process. But Nicole, I think, was dead on. I mean, you have that performance discussion, and if during the course of that performance discussion, when you're dealing with the objective facts of what's occurring in the workplace, something comes out about some sort of issue, then you could be in a situation where you have to start engaging in the process.
Absolutely,
yeah.
That's an important distinction, and I think when we talk about avoiding mistakes, I think a mistake that we all see employers make is wanting to attribute it to something. Why is someone who has maybe been a fine performer before suddenly acting differently? And so it's just, I think, a natural tendency to want to say, something must be wrong. What is it? Can I help you? Instead of just focusing on the employment issue, you're staying after when we're telling you to go home. Now we have an FLSA issue too, right? What are you doing here? Come in, here are the issues we see, and more than likely, I think what we've probably all seen is during that discussion, you get a disclosure of some condition, and then you deal with it. So.
Well, and the next example that we give actually is kind of along those lines. As far as an employee has ADHD, has mentioned the condition to the employer, but has stated he doesn't need an accommodation. The employer disciplines the employee for performance problems related to disorganization, timeliness, and missing appointments. During the meeting, the employee says that his performance problems are probably related to his ADHD, but does not ask for an accommodation. Well, so in this situation, is this notice of a need for an accommodation? Maybe. I mean, certainly the employee has opened the door to having that discussion. You have a known condition. You have problems in the workplace that would seem to be attributed to ADHD, and certainly the employer opening the door to the discussion of or engaging in reasonable accommodation could be as simple as, is there anything the company can provide you to allow you to perform or that you need from the company in order to perform the essential functions of the job? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and this came from a real life example, and so I'll tell you what the employer did in this case. The employee, I don't think the employee knew to ask for an accommodation, really. And so what the employer did was say, how can we help you? Can we help you with some organizational strategies? And they did, and I've been doing this a long time, so I'm always skeptical that these things work, but in this case with this employee, it did work. The employee, they started a tickler system. They set up a regular weekly meeting to make sure that the employee was staying on track. So, I mean, and these are examples of accommodations that, we say accommodation, we think, we can't do all these things. But here are some really simple things that help the employee perform the essential function.
So the next issue that employers face is, so now you may have a request for a reasonable accommodation, or you may have engaged in this process for, to assess a reasonable accommodation. Well, what type of medical documentation can you get when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation? And here actually the EEOC has given us guidance and said that an employer can ask for reasonable documentation about the disability and its functional limitations. So you can ask for information to understand whether this individual has a covered disability, and then what, if any, reasonable accommodations would be needed. Again, this is not a request for all medical records related to this employee. This is a narrow request that's job-related, business necessity, to say, here's your job, can you work and perform these essential functions with or without a reasonable accommodation? If you need an accommodation, what is it? So where we see employers making mistakes or having having issues is in getting that medical documentation. Sometimes they're not sending out information through the employee to have them request documentation from their employer, or from their physician. So not getting medical documentation, or getting insufficient documentation where it merely just says this person's under my care and needs to be late to work. Well, that doesn't give us enough to assess, is this an ADA accommodation situation? Likewise, something that's come up a number of times recently is an employee, when the employer asks for medical documentation, the employee responds, well, that's medical privacy, that's HIPAA. You're going to violate HIPAA if I ask my doctor to give that to you. And so that's something that employers need to be prepared to answer, is that, as an employer, HIPAA applies to covered entities, and as an employer, that is not one of those covered entities. An employer is not a covered entity for HIPAA purposes. And we're given the ability, the employers are given the ability, when they're acting in their capacity as an employer, to get medical documentation as to this individual's ability to work. So medical privacy, may be something that an employee claims. However, it's not going to stop you from being able to get information that you need. And certainly having that discussion with the employee that, that they understand what's being asked for. So sometimes employees think you are requesting all of their medical documentation. So having that conversation with an employee to say, hey, this is what we're trying to assess. We're trying to, figure out how we can, what you need and how we would be able to provide that.
Yeah, a couple points kind of stemming from that. Between the doctor and the employee, that is a HIPAA issue. So the doctor may want the employee to sign a release. That's where the HIPAA issue lies. The doctor can't release information to a third-party employer without the employee's consent, but not between the employer and the employee. There's a EEOC informal opinion letter, so it's not binding, but kind of governing this, and it goes to a point Nicole made, which is that explain why you're asking for the information. The EOC reviewed a medical questionnaire that an employer was using, and one of the things that they found kind of lacking was that there was no explanation of why you're asking all these questions. So it helps the employee understand, and frankly, it helps the doctor understand too. You know, we assume the doctors understand all these things about the ADA and all our processes, but it's not something they spend any time looking at. So they may be wondering, why are you asking questions that seem intrusive, or that maybe they can't even answer, and we want them to tell us that. So if they explain, if they understand the process, lots of times I'll use just a cover letter. Doctor, your employee requested this accommodation. Here's what your employee asked for. I need your help. You know, we employer need your help in evaluating it. It doesn't have to be a long letter. It doesn't have to give the whole story, but it helps everyone understand. And of course, you know, it's more documentation for your file.
Right. And with that medical documentation, what does the employer need to know? Well, nature of the medical condition, so you can assess, is this a disability? And with that goes the likely duration of the medical condition. A lot of times we'll get responses back where we don't know how long this condition is to last. Is this a 2-week issue? Is this a lifetime condition? You know, what are the functional limitations? And then is there a need for a reasonable accommodation? And if so, what are the types of accommodations that could assist the employee in performing those essential functions of the job? Again, with another issue that tends to come up is that an employee may be treating with a specialist for a specific condition, but gives you a note from their general family practitioner who says, you know, this person has reported to me that they have X. Employers should be able to go back, and you get the ability to designate who should fill out that or give you that medical information. So if they're treating with a physician or with a specialist, ask for the specialist to give you the information if that's what is driving the request for accommodation.
A question there, please?
Yeah, for that documentation from the doctor or specialist, who's responsible for any costs associated? Because I've seen doctors' offices now request payment. Is that the employee's responsibility? They're the one asking for the accommodation, or is it now the employer's responsibility? We're trying to document our file.
So the question, go ahead. The question is, who's responsible for the payment, the medical expense of obtaining that evaluation relative to the employee's request for accommodation?
I would say it's the employer. Unless it's coupled with they're going, you know, the employee's already going, already has an appointment set up, you know, but otherwise if it's purely driven by the employer, I would say it's the employer's cost. You know, a kind of final word on documentation is making sure that it's, again, not overbroad. Here is where we may, you know, we want to be mindful of GINA. What is the information? So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And it's where we may get too much information, and now suddenly we have employees or their families' genetic information. So again, when we're requesting documentation from a medical provider, if we can give specific questions that are narrowly tailored, and to Miriam's point, so that the doctor understands what you need, what information you need, that's certainly the best course of action.
All right, so you figured out that your employee has a condition, and now it's time to reasonably accommodate. Figure out how you can help them perform the essential functions of the job. And that's really what you have to focus on. What is it that you need the employee to do? How are you going to find out what assistance they need? So we have to provide a reasonable accommodation unless it will affect safety or unless it's undue hardship. We don't always spend a lot of time talking about undue hardship because it's a pretty hard standard to prove. I always want to mention it's there, but I very rarely see undue hardship situations. The interactive process, we talk about it like everybody understands it, but that's what we're going to spend some time going through now. What does that mean? What are employers' obligations? What are employees' obligations as part of that process? So it's really to interact with the employee to find out how they can perform the essential functions of the job. So if you've come to the other or heard our other sessions, you know that I'm a big advocate of job descriptions. So here I am working it in again. how do we know what the essential functions of the job are unless we have a good job description? So I thought we would show you 2 different job descriptions. And this is an example of something that we just modified. So you can see the one had some essential functions, but it missed a whole lot of things that are really important to how the employee gets the job done. So highlighted on the one column are the things that we added that give a little more flavor, and that probably will go to whether the employee can meet the requirements of working with other people. So if you've got someone who maybe says, well, I need an accommodation of working by myself. How do you get the job done? No, you have to interact with other people in certain jobs. Maybe there are jobs where you don't, but in this job you had to. You have to be able to walk around because you're delivering supplies. In this particular situation, we know that regular and reliable attendance is a huge issue. So frequently the issue comes up about, does the employee actually have to be at work on a regular basis? In this case, we added to the job description as an essential function regular and reliable attendance. And here, why? Because in this case, people were getting ambulances out. You have to be there to clean the ambulance and get it out. You can't just put it off. It's not work that will wait. You need to be at work to get your job done. So, and there are lots of cases now where the courts turn to the job description to understand what those essential functions are. And I would say the ADA doesn't always give the employer a lot, but the regulations and the court cases make clear, employer, you get to define those essential functions at least up front, so why not take advantage of that by just really thinking through the process of how the job works.
And then if an essential function is not on your job description, it's going to be hard to show that it is an essential function.
Right. I mean, they're clear. There are a couple cases where the court said this wasn't mentioned as an essential function, or this was mentioned as an essential function. So there's a case out of Michigan where a store manager wanted to work less than 40 hours. Well, she was the only manager in the store. I think it was some sort of telephone store, and it was right in her job description. And in that case, the court said no, being able to work more than 40 hours, so being able to work overtime is an essential function. But there are other cases that absolutely go the other way when it's not clear that those hours are an essential function.
Right, and everyone's harping on it, so I'll just add my 2 cents. It's so important. This has to happen, of course, before the request for accommodation comes in. It doesn't do us really any good to sit there and define the job after the fact, because then I just lend myself to the argument that I'm manufacturing a job description to avoid an issue. So we talk about it under the FLSA, we talk about it under the FMLA, we talk about it under the ADA, the absolute importance of having an accurate and up-to-date job description. So we always recommend, whether it's a annual thing or your fiscal year, is take stock. There are certain things as good employers we should take stock of on a regular basis, and job descriptions is absolutely one of those things, because look how effective it can be in defending you if you're ever called to task. If you don't have it and it is an essential function, you're going to end up litigating that point. And you're going to have a potential question of fact when you don't need to have one. Because guess what the employee is going to say if that's the issue of contention? Oh, that's not required. I didn't have to do that regularly. So let's take the question out of it and do ourselves a favor and sit down with those job descriptions.
Yeah, sometimes a good time to do is, if you have an opening. So, okay, now we're posting something. Let's go back, so you're not burdened with 100 job descriptions at one time. It's as that position becomes available. So, okay, you know what the employee does. You have to engage in the interactive process. Okay, these are 2 quick slides that are going to help us understand how to get that. You need to get the facts. What is the employee's medical condition? We have that from the doctor. Do they have a disability? We're going to assume they have a disability. The employee has given you something in writing, they've said something to the supervisor. Sit down with the employee and understand what it is they need. And the focus should be on how can we help you do your job. So one of the mistakes that I think we all sometimes see is an assumption. Something gets communicated from a frontline supervisor to HR, and everyone's up in arms because there's no way we can accommodate that. Well, if you sit down with the employee and you listen to them, maybe there is a way to accommodate it. So ask the employee what it is they need. Now, sometimes employees do have requests that are outrageous, and you got to bring it back to how will that help you perform the functions of your job. That's always the focus. It's not performing the job, it's how will that help you perform the job. So once you may have asked the physician for information about the condition, maybe, sometimes this process is compressed and that all comes at once, but maybe you need to go back to the physician and get more information about what type of accommodations the employee needs. And I think I mentioned this in the next slide too, but I'll mention it here as well. Sometimes you need to go to other people to get information. And by other people, I mean other professionals. So the doctor, I had this happen recently where the doctor said, I can't assess what will help this employee. I know what his condition is, but I can't assess that. Sometimes you need an ergonomist. Sometimes you might need an IT person. So the example I wanted to mention earlier was I had a client who had an employee, was screening an applicant for a call center position. The applicant sounded great. They'd worked in the call center before. They're going to call them in for an in-person interview. And the applicant disclosed that they were blind. Well, here's an example. Everyone went into a tizzy. Well, how can we possibly accommodate this person? Well, okay, let's call this person back and ask them, because you're going to be, the nature of the call center was you're looking at screens with lots of information. And the applicant said, well, I've just gone through some training and there's a program that will read the screen to me. Okay, he called me back. We said, okay, let's call the company that manufactures that and see if it'll work with our system. So we did that. And as it turned out, it wasn't a reasonable accommodation in that situation because the volume of information couldn't be read by the program. But this employer went through those steps, and after having gone through those steps, and they kept the applicant informed of the process, here's what we're doing. At the end, they told the applicant that they couldn't reasonably accommodate her, because the program wouldn't work. And so they engaged in the process, and it came out with an outcome where they couldn't provide a reasonable accommodation. But they didn't just assume, even though they might have wanted to, that they couldn't accommodate. So here, that's determining an accommodation. Sometimes it's the exact accommodation that the employee wants. Sometimes it's modified, and sometimes it's, we can't accommodate you.
That's an important point, because sometimes that gets lost, that the employee just doesn't automatically get their first pick at accommodation. It is a process, and as Miriam is stating, it's you get to evaluate options as an employer, and you can take cost if there's a less costly way of accommodating. Definitely can take that into consideration, et cetera. So it's not, the employee doesn't control what the ultimate accommodation is. Obviously has input, but is not the final decision maker.
So just going some other tips, some of these we've already talked about, but one thing that also I think sometimes gets lost in the process is documenting what's happened. If you have to defend yourself, you want to have a record of, we met with the employee, here's what we asked them. And so sometimes those are just verbal discussions, so you want to, I think, follow up either with, I like a written communication or a tailored email communication. You don't want to go on and on about everything that was said, but you want to document that you've met and what the employee's next steps are. You're going to see the doctor, you're going to do this. It's interactive, so the employee has some obligations, and there are pretty good cases out there that say if the process stops because the employee failed to follow through, then the employer's obligation is over. Now, if you're going to rely on that, you want to make sure it's really well documented. So let's take a look. And this kind of goes to, again, one of the question that we had. What I would say is, accommodations don't typically come up in a nice, neat package. Yes, employer, I need this accommodation. And it's kind of the example we had and what Nicole talked about. Lots of times it's employee gets a performance review, and maybe it's lower than they expected, a wage increase is lower than they expected, and all of a sudden the employee is saying, yeah, well, it's because I had this condition, I couldn't work as many hours, or I couldn't, I had to be away. Well, what do you do in that case? I mean, here you're giving out a performance review. Do you stop? You have to, again, separate your two issues out. One is past the performance we've seen, and presumably we didn't know about the medical condition. I think probably a lot of you know that sometimes maybe your frontline manager did know about the condition, so that's something you have to always explore. But let's assume nobody knew about the condition. Okay. We're evaluating the performance that has occurred, but now that we know about the condition, we have to go forward and engage in that interactive process. We can't ignore it. Would you change the employee's rating? No, the rating reflects back on what's already happened, and if the employee didn't disclose their condition, you're not obligated to change the rating, give them a raise if you didn't give them a raise, but you are obligated going forward to act on the information that you have. Another situation, and slightly different, but the same thing. Employee asks for an accommodation because medicine makes her groggy and she can't come in. Well, and this kind of goes to the scenario we were talking about. What do you have to provide the accommodation? Well, it depends. What's her job? Is she the only person who's in the store? Could she work on a later shift? So each situation requires a case-by-case analysis. But what if the employee who has a psychological condition has some sort of violent outburst? What do you do in that case? Well, again, you have to look at each situation on a case-by-case basis. You're not required to keep someone in a position who is a danger to other employees or your customers, but you're going to want to go through and evaluate, is this a real danger? Is it likely to happen again? What caused it? But again, you don't have to endanger the health of your current employees or your customers. Now, let's get to a hot issue in accommodation, which is telecommuting. We're hearing a lot, employees asking for an accommodation of working from home or having a flex schedule. And so here's a fact scenario. A purchasing employee requested to work from home for 4 days as needed. Well, that's a little sketchy to me, as needed, because she had irritable bowel syndrome. Well, the employer's response was regular and predictable attendance is an essential function of her job, and the ADA doesn't require the employer to eliminate essential job functions. The EOC's position was employees' presence at work wasn't absolutely necessary. Well, the district court, and this was in a Michigan district court agreed with the employer and said, basically, working from home is rarely a reasonable accommodation. Great, employment lawyers everywhere are thinking, good, this is a good decision, but not so fast. The employee appealed the case to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit said, wait a second, you have to think about how things are being done. And maybe in the past, telecommuting wasn't a reasonable accommodation, but it might be a reasonable accommodation now. And so this is a pretty big, important case because it kind of opens the door to thinking about accommodations have to keep track with the times. We have to, so something that might not have been reasonable 10 years ago, maybe when people couldn't log in from home or they couldn't Skype, might be reasonable now. And so we can't just stay focused on this is how we've always done this job. Is there a way to do the essential functions in a different way? So this case is now gone back to the district court. The appellate decision didn't resolve it. It'll probably go to trial. But it opens the door to other cases, I think, where employees ask for telecommuting. So as happens really often, there's just a case in a report that we get today. A case that was issued yesterday from a New York district court about telecommuting. It's a really interesting case. A federal employee of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York asked to telecommute. And he had post-traumatic stress disorder related to 9/11. And he was moved to an office overlooking the site of 9/11. And he asked to either be moved to a different office or to work from home. And the government repeatedly said no. They offered him a whole bunch of other options, a cubicle that faced the other way, white noise, a whole bunch of things, and his doctor apparently kept saying, no, that's not the accommodation that he needs. One of the things that I think is interesting about this case, though, and it's a risk for employers that I want to point out is, one of the things the court noted in the opinion is that, number one, this employer, the Federal Reserve, let other employees telecommute. And number two, they moved other employees to this second site. The employee ended up retiring. As soon as he retired, they moved other employees to the second site. So you can't just look at what this employee, you have to look at, have you allowed other arrangements for other employees, and can the employee point to that and say, wait a second, you let this employee telecommute, or you let this employee have a flexible schedule. So they're not little silos. You have to look at what you're doing with your workforce. And really, in the first telecommuting case I mentioned, that was an issue as well. Other employees were telecommuting, and that was kind of the downfall for the employer. So I think that Nicole and I were talking about this case, and she had an interesting little anecdote that kind of relates to it.
Well, I was telling Miriam that I actually heard on the radio while driving to Columbus on Monday that the government at USA.gov is advertising on the radio to employees to go to its website to learn how it can ask its employer, or how individuals can ask their employer for telecommuting options and how they can telecommute to work. So it's interesting to me that the government was involved with this, saying no, you can't telecommute, and yet is telling other employees how to approach their private employers to find telecommuting options. So, yeah.
You know, at the risk of sounding really discriminatory about this, you know, we have a telecommuting policy too, but the employees who get to work at home have no discipline in their record. They have generally worked for, and it's in writing, what you have to do to be able to get this privilege, because we consider it a privilege. There's certain things, I'll put it that way, and you can't have an excessive absenteeism. Not absences based on medical conditions. No FMLA is involved or anything, just regular non-FMLA or ADA absences. So you have to fit this pattern, or you have to fit these requirements. And so, at least what I've seen in my job is that the people who, you know, many of our employees, they come to work, they do their job. People who take advantage of the ADA and the FMLA are generally, you see them over and over again. It's a pattern, and you know that they're playing the system. You absolutely know it. And it really is frustrating for my clients, my client departments, because there's not a whole lot they can do. I mean, that you just don't get a lot of options under the law to catch those people who are playing the system. So like with the telecommuting issue, you know, if I'm an employee and I see that I could run this scam, if that's what I want to do, and try to telecommute, then I'm going to look at those other employees and say, well, you let the other ones do it. But again, we don't just let anybody do it. You have to earn that right. I mean, how do you deal with this?
Well, so the question really, that's a very good question, actually. It relates back to a point in this case I just mentioned. The question was, you know, there are lots of times when employers have telecommuting policies, there are conditions associated with it. You know, you can't have performance problems, you can't have attendance problems, non-medical attendance problems. Absolutely, employer can absolutely establish those conditions. In this case I mentioned, that was one of actually the Federal Reserve's points, was this employee had some performance problems. Unfortunately for them, they let employees with lower ratings and other worse problems telecommute. But you can establish performance criteria. You do have to sometimes look beyond those when you're accommodating, but I think if we go back to what Nicole mentioned earlier, which is focus on the performance. So it is frustrating, but if you're always focused on what are the job criteria? So if you're a malingerer and you're trying to get out of working, if we have established criteria, we can always go back to that criteria, because one thing that's clear under the ADA is you don't have to modify the job expectations. So if you have to produce X widgets or so many reports or process so many cases, whatever it is, the employer can hold you to that standard. So I think if you're what may be helpful in alleviating some of that frustration is getting your supervisors to focus on what are the employees, what are our expectations, and how are they failing to meet those expectations, and let's address that. And so if you always go back to that, I think it'll at least help a little bit. Now, I think Jim is going to talk now about another frustrating aspect of maybe the most frustrating.
But before, because we've gotten this question a couple times, so I want to address it. The question is, if an employee is terminated and they were disabled, but it did not materially affect their ability to perform their job, would there be exposure to the employer? So we're talking about, you meet the definition of a disability, you're a qualified individual with a disability, because in this scenario, despite your disability, you can perform the essential functions of the job, and then you are terminated. Is there exposure there for disability discrimination? And the answer would be yes. If I let you go because of your disability, and the answer would be no if I let you go for objective performance-related reasons, to address that particular question, because I know we've gotten it a couple of times.
Well, so here's, I think, the thing. I mean, almost anybody can have a disability, right? So you terminate somebody, they've got who knows what condition. If they don't understand the reasons for their termination, they may jump to the conclusion that it's because of their disability. I told you I had diabetes and you terminated me. But if the employee understands, no, you didn't meet these performance-based expectations, or maybe it's something else. No, we're doing a reduction in force and we don't need your position anymore. If they understand the legitimate non-discriminatory reason, you've made it clear, then of course we know anybody can file a lawsuit. But is it less likely? Are you more able to defend a charge if they file it, or is it less likely that someone will take that lawsuit? Absolutely. So that's why, documentation of the legitimate non-discriminatory reason for the termination is always so important.
And it always ties into, and we talk about this in all of it always comes up in all of our programs relative to documentation. I've had several, I guess over the past 18 years, clients that are at-will employers, for example. When they are going to terminate someone, the letter that they'll give is, as an at-will employer, we're exercising our right to terminate your employment effective immediately. And to get to Miriam's point, if you don't state the reason and you hide behind something like that, which is, in my opinion, it's silly because you're shooting yourself in the foot, then the employee will come back with disability, race, gender, fill in the blank, it really doesn't matter. And then you will, after they come forward with the charge, you will say, well, no, the real reason was because you didn't meet the production requirements, and I told you that, but you didn't write it down when you terminated them, and you didn't tell them that. So don't be afraid. The truth shall set you free. It really does in this context. That is, you have a reason for making an employment decision. Don't be afraid to state it. And don't be afraid to act promptly when you have the facts in hand to take that discipline. Because invariably what happens is now I'm getting off track, but when employers wait, guess what happens? All of a sudden you'll get an FMLA request between the time you were going to take the action and then when you actually did. Or they'll bring a claim they'll say, Bob has been bothering me, and now you have a potential harassment claim, and now you're in a retaliatory situation. So state the reason, and don't move and be imprudent. Don't sacrifice quality for speed, but when you have the facts in hand, execute. because you'll be better off for it.
Yeah, it's just a little preview of our final
Yeah.
session, termination process. You know, sometimes I think, and you probably have seen this with maybe higher level executives who are always like, well, we're an at-will employer. Why do we care? And the way I always try to explain it is it's like two tracks. And they're two separate issues. At will is your employment contract. Your employment relationship is at will. I can fire you for any reason or no reason. Discrimination is a whole separate track. Any reason or no reason, but not an illegal reason. And so we have to go over to this second track and say, is there an illegal reason? And they're separate, but they're not mutually exclusive.
So just to, as Miriam was alluding to, the other real headache now for employers when it comes to accommodations and the ADA is leave. And leave as an accommodation, is it an accommodation under the law? Yes, it can be. And then we invariably get the question, well, how much? How much time? And that's a very good question. And if you were here at our employment law seminar, it was 2 or 3 years ago, and if she's watching, I say this with all due respect, but the question was asked of, we had an EOC director or assistant director that came and spoke to our audience, and the question was asked of her, well, how long is it? Can you tell me how long I have to provide leave and satisfy the reasonable accommodation? And the answer, and this is the EOC's position still, is that it's dependent on the case. I'm not going to give you a number. So that can be very frustrating for employers. We're starting to get now some traction on this from the courts, and we'll get to that in a moment. But remember this, yes, leave is an accommodation, but it has to enable the employee ultimately to be able to perform the essential functions of the job. So indefinite leave, for indefinite leave's sake, is not a reasonable accommodation if providing leave will never ultimately get the employee to be able to perform the essential functions of the job. So that's a very important, indefinite leave is not required. Unfortunately, as I said, the ADA places no time limitation on exactly how long is long enough, okay? We used to use, frankly, the FMLA as a benchmark. That used to be a nice rule of thumb. Hey, if I've given you 12 weeks required under the FMLA, whether or not I was an FMLA covered employee or not, or whether this employee was an FMLA covered employee or not, that was a good benchmark. Don't think so anymore. We are recommending at least 6 months and probably up to a year. Okay, and again, that I don't want you to write that down and say that's it. It does depend on the case, but at a minimum, I think 6 months is a good rule of thumb. So when we're talking about when is enough, FMLA, it is 12 weeks. We have a very clear line there. But then my FMLA leave, if that doesn't alleviate the situation, this is where the ADA and the FMLA can intersect with one another. That is, if the condition that prompted the FMLA leave otherwise rises to the level of a disability under the ADA, then I may be in a situation as a reasonable accommodation to provide additional leave. Again, if that leave is reasonably expected to return that employee to work, okay, to allow them to perform the essential functions of the job. That is the goal of any accommodation. And if that's why a qualified individual with a disability is an individual with a disability that with or without an accommodation can perform the essential functions of the job. If you can't perform the essential functions of the job, either with or without that accommodation, here being leave, then you're not going to be covered under the statute.
Well, for leave, an important reminder is that medical documentation that we talked about earlier should help to establish that leave. I mean, we should understand from the documentation that we get from the provider what's the expected duration.
That's exactly correct.
And if it's an indefinite, if it's an unknown, then to follow up on that, to push the doctor to see if something specific can be provided, to assess, is this really just an indefinite leave request?
And actually, the case I was talking about is we're starting to get some traction. This is in the back of your book. This is the Huang decision versus Kansas State. And this is coming out of the 10th Circuit. So we're starting to get some traction. Here, Huang was a professor, and she was going to be teaching for that fall, winter, and summer, the following summer, or spring and summer semesters. Right before she was going to begin, unfortunately, she was diagnosed with cancer. And the university provided her with a 6-month leave as an accommodation. And then after the 6 months had passed, she still was incapable of returning to work. And so she asked for more time. And the facts of this case were there was no traction as to just how much time she was going to need to be out. It was an indefinite request. And the court there said, and I've actually cited to some, I think, very good language, I mean, in terms of how to view this. This court was, obviously, I consider this a pro-employer opinion, but the language, I think, makes a lot of sense. If the leave has no hope of ever returning you back to the job, which was, as a professor, that's an essential function. You've got to be here in order to teach your students. Then the university is not required to allow you indefinite leave under the ADA. So we're starting to get some traction here. I mean, this 6 months here was long enough for this particular court, coupled with the fact that the individual's doctor could not tell Kansas State when it was expected that she would be able to return to work. So again, and we've touched on this, what are some of the factors we're considering when looking at leave as an accommodation? Can they provide either the employee and or his or her doctor or other healthcare professional an estimated date when they will be able to perform the essential functions of the job? And again, the whole goal is to be able to perform the job. So what do? I think we review our leave policies here. Inflexible leave policies are on the EOC's radar, as you probably know. Nicole and I were just reviewing some of the decisions. Sears in 2009 got hit for $6.2 million because they had, after, I forget if it was 9 months or 12 months in that case, but if you were on leave beyond that, you were automatically terminated, okay? And the same happened in 2012. It was a trucking company, $5 million. Same type of deal. You can't have an inflexible leave policy in your manual. That is not going to be tolerated because this is an individualized assessment. So to the extent that you do have that, we need to revisit that right away and make sure that your leave policies jive with what the state of the law is now. So to sum up, are there limitations on the accommodation that employers must make? What is not required under the ADA? Removing essential job functions is not required. Creating new jobs, creating a new position that the employee may be able to perform is not required under the ADA. Although you do have to be careful of some state laws, because there are some state laws under their disability laws where that can be an accommodation. Providing personal need items such as eyeglasses and mobility aids, you're not required to do that. Relieving employees of the obligations to comply with work rules. You know, an employee that presents with Tourette's syndrome and has these vicious outbursts, it would otherwise violate our decorum rules. I mean, we're allowed to enforce our decorum rules even in the face of an employee that presents with that type of disability. Indefinite leaves, as we've just harped on, are not required. And providing, we've said this numerous times, but providing the exact accommodation that the employee wants. It's an interactive process, and so there is a give and take there. If there's another accommodation that is easier for the employer to provide that will allow the employee to perform the essential functions of the job, then that is fine. as opposed to taking the employee's first choice at accommodation. Miriam, Nicole, myself to a degree today have all been harping on the need for properly documenting ADA situations. This is just, it goes back to Employment Law 101, right? Documenting what is occurring, whether it's the medical documentation, our follow-ups with the employees. We are documenting this process the entire way because that will be our evidence that we did in fact comply with the ADA and its accommodation requirements. If you don't document the process, then what happens? It's a he said, she said situation. You might have done everything right to the T, but if you don't document it, you can't count on your employee that's suing you to, they will conveniently get amnesia relative to certain things that actually did occur. And that buys you a lawsuit that can go to a jury. It's very difficult for us to dismiss that type of lawsuit on a motion. Schedule periodic meetings to discuss progress. That makes good sense. Again, we're writing down key decision points in writing. And be careful of email in this. We don't want to be the casual comment and you didn't necessarily thoroughly think about what you wanted to say. That can be dangerous because in now our world of discovery, email, text messages, all of that is subject to discovery. We're required to preserve it if it actually exists, and those can come back to bite you.
Well, and just a point on the email is be careful if you're putting in an email what you are giving the individual as a reason, or what you're saying is a reasonable accommodation. If you haven't talked through that situation to see if that actually is going to work, and you now have an email where you've promised this individual a flexible work schedule, and then you talk to their supervisor and they can't work a flexible work schedule, and they need to be accommodated in some other way.
And one other point about email too, just, sometimes the email chain may have medical information in it, maybe from the employee. And, we all know how easy it is for emails to be passed on, either accidentally or intentionally. So, you always run that risk too with emails related to ADA situations.
I mean, a good rule of thumb is that these are in-person meetings and we are taking hard notes relative to what's going on and avoiding email to the best of our ability. So hopefully takeaways from today. Let's take a look at our leave and accommodation policies and make sure that they're up to date. In particular, if we have an inflexible leave policy or a date certain, we need to be looking at that. Let's look at our job descriptions. We see how powerful they can be in terms of defining what the essential functions of the job are. Let's train supervisors and managers, at least to the buzzwords, so that they can refer an individual to HR to see if an ADA situation is present. So they have to be in tune with what the law requires here and what words and what phrases to be in tune with relative to what their employees are telling them. Really engage in the interactive process. I think Miriam's example of the one case involving the call center individual, you saw how that the employer was very engaged and seeing that through the end. Even though it had an ultimate conclusion of not being able to accommodate, the employer followed it through to the letter, and it served them well. Document, document, document. We say that all the time. And then when the situation warrants it, of course, seek advice from counsel. I mean, that's a situation, of course, where you can, I think, in terms of if you're going to be consulting with a group of HR managers and what you want to involve your lawyer in that for privilege reasons and whatnot, protect certain discussions from discovery. And it just makes a lot of sense as you're going through the process to bounce it off your counsel. So we thank you for attending today. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll look forward to seeing you on, I believe it's November 13th, for the last of our 4-part series. So stay tuned. Thanks.